There is a certain kind of person who never quite finishes becoming themselves. Ask them what they do and they pause, not because they're unsure, but because the answer refuses to fit into a single sentence. They might have been a surgeon at 40, a jazz musician at 50, a furniture maker at 60, and if you ask what they'll be at 70, they'll smile in that particular way that suggests they already know, or perhaps that they've stopped believing the question matters at all. You've met them. The neighbor who restores vintage motorcycles and writes poetry, the retired accountant who speaks 4 languages and is learning a 5th, the grandmother who codes. They don't scatter their attention, they gather life differently. And if you've ever felt the pull of a second calling, a 3rd, a 4th, if you've lain awake wondering why one passion has never been enough, then you already understand something the world rarely admits. The mind that loves many things is not a mind that lacks focus. It's a mind that refuses to shrink. This is the psychology of the multi-passionate. The ones who don't outgrow curiosity, they outgrow containers. For most of human history, we were told a story. Find your gift, sharpen it, build your life around its single point. The specialist wins, the generalist wanders, and wandering, we learned, was failure, wearing a prettier name. But here's what that story never explained. The brain wasn't designed for singularity. We are, neurobiologically speaking, prediction machines built for novelty, dopamine systems that light not at repetition, but at the edge of what we don't yet know. When you learn something new, your brain doesn't just acquire information, it remodels itself. New pathways, fresh connections, the sensation we call alive. Psychologists call this multipotentiality, the innate capacity and often the innate need to pursue multiple domains with genuine competence, not as a hobby, not as distraction, as a fundamental orientation toward the world. And yet, we pathologized it. The child who loved both mathematics and dance was told to choose. The adult who succeeded in one career and hungered for another was called restless, uncommitted, afraid of depth. The language we used revealed everything. Jack of all trades, master of none. We turned abundance into insult. But the data tells a different story. Research into what psychologists term interdisciplinary minds reveals something counterintuitive. People with multiple deep interests don't perform worse than specialists over time. In many domains, particularly those requiring innovation, systems thinking, and creative problem-solving, they outperform them. The reason isn't mysterious. They've built cognitive architectures that specialists, by definition, haven't. They see patterns across silos. They transfer solutions from distant fields. They've developed what researchers call cognitive flexibility, the capacity to hold multiple frameworks simultaneously and move between them not as escape, but as strategy. The multi-passionate aren't scattered. They're synchronized across dimensions most people never know exist.
To understand the psychology, you have to start with the feeling, because multipotentiality isn't primarily an intellectual condition, it's an emotional one. The multi-passionate don't simply think about many things, they feel toward many things with equal gravity. And that capacity for depth distributed rather than concentrated shapes everything. Psychologists who study emotional intensity describe a phenomenon called emotional breadth, the range and differentiation of feeling a person can experience. Most of us have narrow bandwidth. We feel strongly about few things. The multi-passionate have broadband. They can be devastated by a failed painting and exhilarated by a breakthrough in coding in the same week with equal sincerity. This isn't volatility, it's range. And maintaining that range requires a particular kind of inner architecture. The multi-passionate must become masters of what researchers call emotional compartmentalization, not in the defensive sense where we wall off pain, but in the integrative sense where we honor multiple simultaneous truths. I can be grieving this and building that. I can be uncertain here and certain there. The heart, they learn, is not a single room, it's a house with many doors, and wisdom is knowing which to open when. But this breadth comes with a particular loneliness. The multi-passionate often struggle to explain themselves. They move between worlds where fluency is assumed, conversations with musicians, then programmers, then botanists, and find themselves translating constantly, never fully at home in any single dialect. The artist friends don't quite understand the science friends don't quite understand the art. And underneath, the old fear that they're spread too thin, that they'll never achieve what the focused achieve, that their life is becoming a museum of beautiful beginnings without a masterpiece at the end. Here's what the research actually shows about that fear. Longitudinal studies of creative achievement reveal that the most enduring contributions, those that reshape fields rather than merely advancing them, often come from individuals with heterogeneous backgrounds. Darwin was a beetle collector before he was a theorist. Ada Lovelace was a poet before she was a mathematician. The breakthroughs emerged not despite their breadth, but through the unusual connections their breadth made possible. The multi-passionate don't fail to achieve depth, they achieve dimensional depth, the kind that only reveals its architecture from above. If you look closely at the life arc of the multi-passionate, you see a pattern that contradicts almost every career narrative we've inherited. They don't climb ladders, they build constellations. Childhood often provides the first clue. The multi-passionate child isn't necessarily the one with the highest grades. They're the one who can't stop asking questions across boundaries, who wants to understand both how the piano works and why the piano works, mechanism and meaning, engineering and emotion. Teachers often find them frustrating. They don't fit enrichment programs designed for single-domain acceleration. They're good at everything, which in educational systems designed for specialization reads as good at nothing in particular. Adolescence brings the first hard choices. The multi-passionate teenager faces what psychologists call identity foreclosure pressure, the social demand to commit to a self before they've had time to become one. They watch peers declare destinies and feel the weight of their own multiplicity as confusion, as flaw. Many will shut down parts of themselves voluntarily, performing a more legible identity. The musician who stops doing math, the athlete who abandons art. The cost isn't visible immediately, it accrues. Adulthood for the multi-passionate often follows one of two patterns. Some find ways to sequence their passions, careers that allow for reinvention, structures that permit periodic transformation. Others integrate, finding the narrow intersection where their multiple loves meet: medical illustration, architectural acoustics, forensic linguistics. The most fortunate discover what researchers call emergent domains, fields that didn't exist until their particular combination of skills created them. But many spend decades in what feels like failure, successful by conventional metrics, accomplished in their declared field, while something essential remains unexpressed. The painter who became a lawyer, the biologist who became a banker. These aren't abandoned dreams, they're hibernating capacities, and neuroscience suggests they never truly sleep. The brain maintains what researchers call latent skill networks, neural pathways established through early intensive practice that remain available for reactivation decades later. The childhood violinist, who hasn't played in 40 years, can, with surprising speed, recover not just muscle memory, but emotional connection to the instrument. The capacity was never lost, it was waiting. This has profound implications for how we understand the multi-passionate life. It means that what looks like starting over is often actually returning. What appears as reinvention is frequently remembering. The 40-year-old who begins painting, the 60-year-old who starts studying neuroscience, they're not becoming someone new, they're becoming someone they always were, beneath the sediment of practical choices and social expectations. The psychologist Ellen Winner, studying what she called talent domains, found that individuals with multiple sustained interests often experience what she termed crystallizing experiences throughout life, not just in youth, but repeatedly. Moments when a new domain suddenly feels inevitable, when the previous mastery becomes foundation rather than destination. These aren't crises, they're continuations. The multi-passionate, it turns out, don't have multiple careers. They have one career, becoming fully themselves. The specific expressions change. The underlying drive remains.
Modern cognitive science has begun to map what the multi-passionate mind actually does, how it processes, integrates, and creates. The findings challenge the specialization paradigm at its foundation. Consider what happens when you achieve genuine competence in any domain. You develop what psychologists call domain-specific schemas, mental frameworks that organize information efficiently. The chess master recognizes board patterns instantly. The physician hears symptom constellations as diagnoses. These schemas are powerful but bounded. They work brilliantly within their territory and poorly outside it. The multi-passionate develop multiple schema sets, and more importantly, they develop what researchers term cross-domain mapping capacity. They can translate between frameworks. They can see when a problem in biology resembles a problem in music theory, when an engineering solution suggests an organizational innovation. This capacity, sometimes called analogical transfer, is one of the most reliable predictors of creative breakthrough. But there's something deeper than problem-solving. The multi-passionate often develop what philosophers call epistemic humility, a fundamental awareness that any single perspective is incomplete. Having genuinely inhabited multiple ways of knowing, they become suspicious of certainty. They recognize that the physicist's precision and the poet's evocation both capture something real, that neither is reducible to the other, and that wisdom often lies in holding both without collapsing them into one. This isn't relativism, it's complexity competence, and in an age of accelerating change, this competence becomes survival skill. The World Economic Forum now lists cognitive flexibility among the most critical capacities for the future workforce, not because it's efficient, but because it's adaptive. The multi-passionate have been training this capacity their entire lives, often without knowing it, often apologizing for not being more focused. There's neurological evidence for this adaptability as well. Studies using fMRI show that individuals with sustained multiple interests demonstrate enhanced connectivity between brain regions typically associated with different cognitive modes. The default mode network, imagination, memory, self-reflection, and the executive control network, planning, decision-making, goal direction. In most brains, these systems alternate. In multi-passionate brains, they increasingly coordinate. The result isn't distraction, it's integration. The multi-passionate mind learns to hold the wandering and the disciplined simultaneously, to dream and execute in the same breath. This is the cognitive architecture of the creator, the inventor, the pattern seer, and it's built not by narrowing, but by expanding, then learning to orchestrate the expansion.
We need to speak of what this costs, because the psychology of multiple passions isn't only about capacity and creativity, it's also about the particular vulnerabilities that come with refusing to choose. The multi-passionate often struggle with what researchers call completion anxiety, the difficulty of finishing when beginning has always been the source of joy. Each new domain offers the dopamine hit of novelty, the pleasure of rapid early learning. Mastery, by contrast, requires repetition, plateau, the long middle where progress feels invisible. For minds optimized for variety, this phase can feel like suffocation. Some respond by perpetual beginning, serial enthusiasts who accumulate skills but never consolidate them. Others push through to mastery in one domain while quietly mourning the abandoned alternatives. Neither solution feels entirely satisfactory. Both carry the residue of roads not taken. There's also the social cost. We live in a world organized around legibility, the elevator pitch, the LinkedIn headline, the dinner party answer to "What do you do?" The multi-passionate often experience what sociologists call categorical invisibility. They don't fit the available slots, so they're seen less clearly than they actually are. Their achievements, distributed across domains, don't accumulate into recognizable identity. They're interesting rather than impressive, curious rather than accomplished, the language of diminishment. And beneath this, the persistent internal question: is this really who I am, or am I simply afraid to commit? The multi-passionate often interrogate their own multiplicity with suspicion, wondering if breadth is actually avoidance wearing intellectual clothing. This self-doubt can become paralyzing, not because it's true, but because it's unanswerable from within. Only time answers, only the accumulated evidence of a life spent returning to multiple loves, despite the cost, despite the confusion, despite the world's preference for cleaner stories. The multi-passionate must learn to trust their own history, to read their persistent curiosity not as immaturity, but as fidelity to something the world doesn't yet have language for. There's grief here too. The multi-passionate must grieve the dream of mastery they were taught to pursue, the deep vertical climb, the single summit. They must accept that their life will look different, that their achievements will be harder to explain, that their obituary may list multiple alsos rather than one definitive was. This grief is real, it deserves acknowledgement. But it's also liberation, because the multi-passionate eventually discover something the specialists often miss. Depth isn't only vertical, it's also dimensional. The geologist who paints, the economist who composes, they don't have two lives, they have one life with multiple access points to the same underlying mystery. The pattern that appears in market cycles and musical phrases, the structure that governs both ecosystem and sonnet. They're not distracted from essence by variety, they're approaching essence through multiple doors.
The mature multi-passionate has learned something essential, not how to choose between their loves, but how to let their loves speak to each other. How to structure a life not around a single center, but around a field, a territory large enough to contain their range without fragmentation. This often involves practical architecture, the studio arranged for multiple practices, the schedule protecting different modes of attention, the relationships with people who understand that presence doesn't require singularity. These aren't luxuries, they're necessities for minds that die in too small containers. But more than practical, it involves narrative reconstruction. The multi-passionate must learn to tell their own story differently, not as failed commitment, but as sustained exploration, not as lack of focus, but as abundance of attention. They must become bilingual in a sense, fluent both in the world's language of specialization and in their own native tongue of multiplicity. This bilingualism is exhausting, but essential. It allows them to function in systems not built for them, while maintaining internal integrity.
Psychologists who study what they call self-concept complexity find that individuals with multiple valued identities demonstrate greater resilience in the face of setback. When one domain fails, others remain. When one identity is threatened, others provide stability. The multi-passionate don't put all their self-worth in one basket. They've distributed it across a portfolio of becoming. This isn't hedging, it's wisdom. And it produces something the world desperately needs: perspective that doesn't depend on single vantage points. In an age of polarization, of algorithmic enclosure in echo chambers, the multi-passionate offers something radical: the demonstrated possibility of holding multiple truths without collapsing them into one or fragmenting them into many. They've practiced this holding their entire lives. We're living through a transformation in how work, learning, and identity are organized. The career ladder is becoming the career lattice. The portfolio replaces the position. The generalist, properly understood as someone with multiple genuine depths rather than superficial breadth, is becoming not eccentric, but essential. The psychology of multiple passions offers a map for this transformation. It suggests that we need to reframe how we recognize competence, how we credential skill, how we organize education and labor markets. The multi-passionate have always existed. What's changing is the possibility that they might stop apologizing for what they are. For individuals, the research offers permission. Permission to stop forcing premature commitment, permission to trust that exploration can be its own form of depth, permission to believe that the connections you see between distant domains are real, valuable, and perhaps more needed than the expertise that can't see them. There's something almost spiritual in the multi-passionate orientation when fully matured, a kind of holy curiosity that refuses the world's demand that we become small enough to be understood. These individuals insist on the fullness of human capacity, the right to love music and mathematics, healing and carpentry, ancient languages and emerging technologies, not as hobbies that distract from real life, but as the very texture of a life fully lived. They remind us that identity isn't a destination, but a practice, that we are not what we do, but how we attend, that the person who can bring fresh eyes to multiple fields may serve the world more deeply than the person who never looked beyond one.
If you recognize yourself in this, if you've felt the pull of multiple paths, if you've apologized for your range, if you've wondered whether your failure to choose represents some deficiency, I want to offer you something the research makes clear. You are not unfinished. You are not scattered. You are engaged in a form of human development that the narrow metrics of single-domain achievement cannot capture. Your multiplicity is not immaturity refusing to commit, it is capacity refusing to shrink. The world will keep asking you what you do, you will keep struggling to answer, but perhaps the answer is simpler than it feels. You do what humans have always done when they refuse to be reduced to function. You explore, you connect, you become, continuously, variously, entirely yourself. There is no final form for the multi-passionate, no ultimate integration that resolves all tension. There is only the next question, the next skill, the next love, and the slowly accumulating wisdom of a life spent refusing to become too small to contain your own curiosity. The multi-passionate don't fail to find themselves, they succeed in becoming too large to be found in any single place. And in a world that keeps trying to make us choose, that refusal is its own kind of integrity, its own kind of courage, its own kind of home.